Academies Alliance.
Okay.
Well, the first thing I want to say, I'm delighted to be here. I am thrilled, actually, by what happened at Labour Party conference. I think constituency Labour parties have been the force for real change in the Labour Party, and I want to applaud you for the work that you have done, and particularly the SEA, the work that the SEA has done. I want to take you back to 1989 and Gordon Brown, when he was lining himself up to take over from Blair, made a speech. It was a great speech. I was stunned. He said what he wanted to do was to raise the funding of every state school child to the level of every private school child. Had he done that, it would have been a revolutionary move. And really, when you're talking about what we need to do for our education system, that is it. We need to have a massive injection, a Marshall Plan or a New Deal for education, and that's why I think Jeremy Corbyn's absolutely right to talk about a National Education Service. And I think there are so many issues, Jackie's touched on some, but you could go through every single aspect of a teacher and a child's life and find things that need changing. I've been in education for 30 years. I started off as a science technician when it was ILIA, and now I'm still a full-time teacher. I'm a history teacher in a secondary school, and it is just astonishing the things that I do as a teacher. I work in I teach as an exam factory man. I teach them how to pass an exam, boom, boom, boom. It's extraordinary what I do. I do it very well. In fact, I had Ofsted last week and I got through it with flying colours. So I've learned how to game the system in my own way. But really what we want is, and Jackie alluded to this, we need a whole new idea of what education is for. It is about raising and giving every child opportunities in their wider life. It is not about passing tests. Actually, tests are designed to fail children. They're not there to pass. They're there to make sure that enough fail. And that's what Gove has done with the new GCSE, made sure more kids fail. The gap between those who are doing well and those who are doing less well, what we call the long tail of underachievement, that has widened in the last 5-10 years. So we need an education system that fulfills the needs of children in all different ways, in many different ways. But we also need, and again this is another thrilling thing for me, is we've jumped social mobility and replaced it with social justice as the aim, because we need an education system that tries to help those children who grow up in less fortunate circumstances, rather than privilege the elite and give them all the money. Actually, the children who need it should be getting all the money. Let's be spending £9,000 on the children who really need it. So we need a new deal in education. And I wanted to try and be useful to you as constituency party members, because I think you'll know from my point of view that when I think of academies, do you know one name that sticks in my head? Tony Blair. Well, actually there's another. Anthony Adonis, Lord Adonis. You've got to remember, and you've got to account for the fact that the academy, it was actually, Tony Blair nicked a rotten Tory idea. To be truthful, the City Academy, the CTCs, which were a failure, Baker's failure. But Tony Blair picked up that idea and invented it. And in Tony Blair's way, he sold it as a social justice measure. It was sold as this, we're going to, actually he said, we're going to throw money at the schools that really need it. And you saw the first academies with fancy buildings, you know, millions of pounds spent on luxury buildings. And in the first 5 years of the academy programme, that's what it did. It took schools in difficult circumstances, threw money at them, and gave over the control of them to a ragbag of philanthropists. You'll know in this part of the world, Lord Harris and the carpetbagger. So it was sold as a social justice measure, and the legacy of that still affects the Labour Party. I'll just explain why. You'll have local councillors, Labour councillors, you'll have Labour members who are on governing bodies, and you will have a situation in constituency parties where still, even after conference, Labour Party members are sitting in council chambers voting for academisation, even though we've just passed a policy saying get rid of it. So there is a tremendous legacy of oh, academisation is a good idea, and an inability to be able to counter it within constituency parties, within the council chamber. It's partly because people aren't prepared to stand up to the law. I mean, the law is rigged. What the 2010 Academies Act did is it created a legal process where you can't actually oppose academies. Local authorities have got a duty to academise any school that goes into special measures, or to support any school that says it wants to go. And all you need is a governing body to say it wants to go, and then it goes. So it's been very difficult. Our job as the Anti-Academies Alliance has been tough, I tell you, because there's been thousands of schools that have academised. We've tried to resist it, but the methods of resisting it, there's no democratic process by which you can stop it. We have stopped some by having huge parental protests and some strike action by teachers, but in general, although we've protested and made a lot of noise, we've not been able to stop academisation. So we have a system at secondary level. Over 70% of the schools are run by academies, and that there are something like 1,500 academy trusts. And I want you to be clear what an academy trust is. A business. It is controlled by a handful of people. Though that handful of people, the people who own the academy trust, are not elected in any way, and they are accountable to no one. They say we're accountable to Ofsted and the DfE, but they are not accountable. That is why we are now seeing hundreds of scandals, financial scandals, you know, about related party transactions where they give contracts to their best mates. All these things that have become, which have made the academy brand toxic, things that we predicted would happen, have now come to fruition, and it is a parlous state. And that's why I think I've been battling within Labour for a long time. I mean, when we first started campaigning, people said, Estelle Morris, can you remember? Standards, not structures. Don't worry about the structure of education, just worry about the quality of teaching and learning. I've got some sympathy with it, but when the structure has been destroyed and privatised, which is what we have now, a privatised system with no real accountability, you have to address the structural problem. And it's been a real battle in the last few years to persuade Labour politicians to do that, but you've done it. And we've now got front bench who are committed. I won't read you the motion, but they are committed to reversing academisation. And obviously from my point of view, that should be one of the major priorities of the new Labour government. The thing that I wanted to, the warning, and the thing that I want to try and bring in Robert's point about the private schools. You see, the private schools, to me, I 100%, I love Robert's book. It's a wonderful book. I totally support getting rid of all private education. The trouble is, a Labour government is going to have a series of priorities. The 7% of schools are private schools. The 93% are in a mess. What do you do? Do you spend your time trying to bring in those 7% into a messy system, or do you spend your time trying to sort out the 93%? And when you put it like that, it's a no-brainer. The other problem we've got, I'm an NEU member, and I saw a speech by the Joint General Secretary, Mary Bowstead. There are members of the NEU inside private schools who will have trade union rights, and they will have their interests wanting. So it's a much more complicated issue than just saying you want to abolish them. And what appears to have happened at Labour conference is the abolish Eton thing. It's a good headline, but underneath it there's a lot more complicated issues. I don't think we should roll back and say we don't want to abolish them, but I do think we should be saying, actually, we've got a whole series of much more important priorities. It's one there for the end of the Parliament, but right now we've got to sort out funding, we've got to abolish Ofsted, and we've got to set to on academisation. And the last thing I want to say is about how that works, because there is a specific thing you need to understand about academisation and why it is actually privatisation. Every school that is an academy, or you're familiar with the phrase MAT, multi-academy trust. Most schools that are academies are not standalone ones, they are now parts of multi-academy trusts, which may have 5, 10 or 40 odd schools in them. Every multi-academy trust is actually a single school with 40 sites or 20 sites. The governors, each school may have its own governing body, it has no power, so all the power in a MAT is controlled by the CEO of the MAT and the few people in the trust. So schools are no longer legal entities in their own right. They are just in the same way that in a supermarket, you know, you'll have your Tesco's all over here, but they're all controlled by a head office. That's how it works with maths. So what the first thing we have to do is to ensure that every school gets back its own legal entity. So it becomes a legal entity in its own right, with governors that are appointed by the staff, by the local community, by the local council, what we usually call the stakeholder model of governance. So that's the first thing that's got to happen, the restoration of every school in its own legal right. The second thing that's got to happen, is that there's got to be a mechanism, a piece of legislation that says you can go back into the local authority. You can ask me about local authorities. The big problem we have is that local authorities no longer have capacity. They have been trashing their responsibility in education, even though every local authority has a legal responsibility for every child in its borough. They have trashed their central services, their support services for schools. Lots of head teachers and teachers will tell you, what's the point of going back to the local authority? There's nothing there. So we have a job to do. You can't solve education without also solving local democracy, local councils. You know, even the cabinet model of governance has made it impossible to have proper scrutiny over schools. So there's a job to do with local authorities, and we have to create a legal instrument that will then allow schools to campaign to go back into the local authority. I think one of the selling points for academisation is that local authorities weren't very good. And it was always a lie, actually. Some local authorities weren't very good, some were excellent. I worked for ILIA, it was an excellent educational authority. We can build, but it'll take time, new models of locally managed schools that are accountable to their community. So for me, that's the essential point. You can't just wish away or just create a national education service. You've got to build it by recreating local democracy, giving schools the power to then want to go back. So it's a big, long haul, but we've started it. I'm thrilled, so well done. It's a great achievement.
Thanks, Alasdair. Before Sri alters the camera, because we're going to sit down, I just want to mention the Socialist Education Association a bit more, because the resolution that hasn't been given as much publicity as the private schools one came from the Socialist Education Association. And this is how we did it. We actually had a seminar with a union leader there, Kevin came, Courtney, Joint General Secretary of the NEU. We had some lawyers there, QCs, and then we talked about what Labour had said in its manifesto in 2017, which had said, we'll have a national education service locally accountable. Now, if you talk to our front bench, they're not awfully keen necessarily on local authorities. And we looked at all of this and we said, you have got to, the only way forward is to create local education committees. And if we want to be accountable, those local education committees can't just have councillors on it. They've got to be other, we've called it stakeholders, but you know, staff, parents, and so on. And just to say, that's the kernel of the resolution. But those of us in the Labour Party need to keep pushing on that, so that we understand that that is reflected in the manifesto, which has been written now, and so that our front bench understands it, that that is the policy that's going to be implemented. I mention it in particular because it's taken us some time, but inside this magazine, which is our conference edition, was about local education committees, and we know that in some parts of the country the local authorities are very small, and so we're not dismissing the fact that you might have to put 3 or 4 together, and that links in with local government. Also in this, because I occasionally write in it, we are also, for example, challenging the Labour Party on its support for vocational v academic education, and its support for this separate suite of exams that the government is developing called T-levels. Because that, in our view, gets us back to the sheep and goats thing, and actually, you know, a lot of academic needs technical skills. It's this false divide. So that's the other thing that we're challenging, and we're doing more things in the new year.